On the 7th of January 2016, in an article on News 24 Voices titled An Illusion of a Rainbow Nation and pinned in the description, Khumani Matiwane wrote, "The National Geographic describes a rainbow as an optical illusion. That is to say, it does not exist, and its appearance depends on your position relative to where the sun is shining. Therefore, I can posit that the Rainbow Nation only exists in the heads of people detached from reality, and to many, it remains a utopia." They speak of the end of apartheid and the coming into what was called the Rainbow Nation as country going through the stages of grief. And if we all know what the stages of grief are, they are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. In going on to describe how this basic end of apartheid was actually unbelievably chaotic, confusing for a lot of people, with broken returning exiles who were in disbelief and rural folk and urban dwellers who were the real heroes of the liberation struggle being confused, and the springing up of squatter camps like mushrooms, and poverty being on the rise, and land not changing hands. They speak of how the process of denial was facilitated by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which basically sold the falsehood that there was a rainbow nation. The Springboks won the Rugby World Cup. Bafana Bafana then also followed suit, winning the AFCON Cup. And this resulted in national unity and social cohesion and just more delusions of the Rainbow Nation. They write that this was the birth of a good story to tell. South Africa, the land of hope. This phase can be said to symbolize the bargaining stage. The stage is characterized by a massive propaganda campaign that sought to entrench the former liberation movement as the only legitimate party in pursuit of a one-party state, as a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Anybody who's listened to the Thomas Sankara video, which I hope you have, understands what this means. Heroes had to be created. National days airbrushing the South African struggle history were set up in the process of depoliticization. One-sided name changes were effected, where one struggle hero could have an airport in one province, a boulevard in another, and a municipality, all named after him. They close off their opinion piece writing, "Now, 2016 presents us with an opportunity for closure as a nation, as the last 21 years were a false start. Acceptance is the last stage of grief. As painful as it is necessary for the people to accept that the ANC was never in the struggle for the total liberation of occupied Azania, but only fought for 20% share schemes for the ANC national elites, tenders for the ANC regional elites, and the preservation of white privilege to the detriment of the majority of poor black South Africans." So can someone please tell me why in 2023 the president of South Africa is so deluded and so unbelievably up his own ass and misunderstanding and unable to read the room and misunderstanding the power of Africa and how we are basically not in any conversation in the world stage regarding the future, and how he could do this. Singularly, one of the most embarrassing things that I have seen the South African Rainbow Nation narrative produce was this idea that South Africa could go and handle peace talks with Russia about the Ukraine. In an Al Jazeera article on the 22nd of June 2023, Al Jazeera reported on the African leaders led by South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, who returned from a trip to Russia and the Ukraine as part of efforts to resolve the war between the nations. And this is what makes me angry about this whole thing. We aren't even looking to lead Africa as a continent on its own. Africa isn't in conversations about where Africa is going. Africa gets consulted by external parties regarding where Africa is going, and Africa has been happy, in inverted commas, Africa has been happy to sit back and allow people who don't live here, have never lived here, would never live here, and if anything popped off here, would be able to leave at a moment's notice because they've got other options. And people are telling us where our continent should go, how it should be structured, and what it should do. So it says, at the weekend, a quartet of African leaders led by South African President Cyril Ramaphosa returned from a trip to Russia and the Ukraine as part of efforts to resolve the war between the nations. What leverage would any of these people have? Now, the title of the piece is Africa's Russia-Ukraine Peace Mission Criticized in South Africa. And I'm so glad that this was criticized because, first of all, it was a stupid thing for us to try to do. We don't have any clout. You can't sit with nothing to bargain with and go and tell a bunch of people who have more power than you how to react. People who feed off you and tell them how to react. It makes absolutely no sense. It shows, first of all, a complete misunderstanding of what is happening with this whole Russia-Ukraine war and how the US is involved in NATO and how they are actually, this was preventable in the first place. Let me say this. So it says, at the weekend, a quartet of African leaders led by South African President Cyril Ramaphosa returned from a trip to Russia and Ukraine as part of efforts to resolve the war between the nations. Dubbed a peace mission by the group, the trip puzzled many observers, as it should have. Since Russia invaded the Ukraine in 2022, many African countries have remained publicly neutral and abstained from voting against Russia at United Nations meetings, as it should. We have no dog in this fight. None of this is our business. It goes on to say, a recent allegation by the United States ambassador to South Africa that Pretoria was supplying arms to Moscow has also put South Africa in a diplomatic dilemma. All that was before this month's trip. Reportedly brokered by Algerian-born French businessman Jean-Yves Olivier, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. It had no backing from the African Union. Thank goodness someone has their head on straight here. And it was almost thwarted by a number of unexpected scenarios. Firstly, 3 members of the original party, Egypt's Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, Republic of the Congo's President Denis Sassou Nguesso, and Uganda's Yoweri Museveni, cancelled days ahead of the trip. I'm sure they were unbelievably embarrassed, or at least I hope they were. Olivier is a known associate of Nguesso. And then there was a logistical nightmare involving South African security officials. A plane carrying journalists, security personnel, and 15 containers with weapons from Johannesburg was detained at the Warsaw airport by Polish authorities. After 3 days, the plane returned to Johannesburg as Warsaw insisted that the South Africans did not have the correct paperwork for the mission. Please, can you imagine any other Western leader going through this? Imagine them landing in any country, in Africa even, let's not even leave it at Europe. Imagine them landing in any country in Europe and then being told that they don't have the correct paperwork for the mission. How seriously do you think these people take South Africa? How seriously do you think these people take these people who'd gone on this embarrassing mission? It further says, despite these setbacks, Ramaphosa, Senegal's leader Macky Sall, Zambian President Hakainde Hichilema, and Comoros President Azali Assoumani, who also holds the rotating chair of the AU, eventually made it. So did representatives of the Ugandan and Egyptian leaders. The contingent met Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky in Kiev before heading to Moscow to see Russia's Vladimir Putin. They can't even get them in the same room. I'm confused at what they thought would happen here, and yes, I am extremely frustrated, and it is because I'm embarrassed, and I cannot believe that these people were so delusional as to think that this whole rainbow nation only country who got to freedom without civil war, which is absolute nonsense, just by the way, but I cannot believe that anybody thought that that was a license for Cyril Ramaphosa, who is who in the world besides South African president. Outside of South African president, who is he? Who are these people who are relying on Western made wealth in order to remain relevant and in order to remain wealthy? Who are they going to tell the people who pay them to stop fighting? It boggles my mind. The delegation put forward a 10-point plan that included sending prisoners of war and children back to their countries of origin and unimpeded grain exports through the Black Sea. That's wonderful. Of course, that's what should be happening. But the effort is yet to yield any results. Absolutely, completely agree with what they should be doing. I'm not saying that war is wonderful. I'm not a proponent of war. But I also understand that it's not the oppressed who dictate violence. It's the oppressor. So back to the article. During a joint press conference with the African delegation, Zelensky reiterated that there would be no peace agreement while Russia continues to occupy parts of Ukraine, telling reporters that to allow any such dialogue is to freeze the war, to freeze everything, pain and suffering. Russian Foreign Prime Minister Sergei Lavrov said in televised remarks that Moscow shared the main approaches of the African plan, but Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov was quoted by Russian news agencies as saying peace was difficult to realize. As the African delegation was in Kiev, Russian missiles shelled Ukraine, forcing the visiting groups to seek cover in a bomb shelter. So they didn't even stop during the time that this mission was going on. That's how little respect they had for them. They didn't even care enough to stop while the mission was going on, while they were there to try and seek peace. This made me so mad. The mission was an attempt to reaffirm that the country can and does punch above its weight in global terms. Absolutely true. South Africa has it in its mind that we are a first world country, and we are just there's that quote by the writer Steinbeck, and he says about America that the reason socialism never took over in America was because many of the working classes saw themselves as not as an exploited working class, but as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. And I think a lot of us in South Africa have that delusion. And this is not me looking down on anyone or judging anyone, because I once was there. I believed in this whole Rainbow Nation narrative. I believed that we were the best country. Well, I do think we're the best country on earth, but I think Africa is the best. But I believe that politically and economically, we're the best country in the world. I was deluded into believing that because of Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk and what they had done, we had basically led the world and shown the world what could and couldn't happen. The mission was an attempt to reaffirm that the country can and does punch above its weight in global terms, but fell flat largely because South Africa has been naive in foreign policy. Aisha Kajir, a research fellow at Johannesburg-based think tank Africa-Asia Dialogues, told Al Jazeera. Kajir told Al Jazeera that the weakness of the mission is that Africa has not been able to resolve its own conflicts, and that's exactly it. Cyril Ramaphosa cannot fix Africa. He can't fix South Africa, let alone Africa. I know it's not his duty to do that. That's a combined effort. That's the whole point of this channel, to foster that community. But my point is the fact that you can't fix your own problems at home, but you're thinking that you can go to other countries and resolve world conflicts that have implications beyond the geopolitics in the area in which you are actually going, because a lot of us know that this Russia-Ukraine war involves NATO and is actually also a US proxy war. The left-leaning opposition, economic freedom fighters, mocked Ramaphosa and the mission while condemning the Polish authorities. The South African head of state had to travel to Kiev in a compromised state in a war zone without his security detail. These are the people who were put in the back of the bus during the Elizabeth's funeral. So I'm so confused why anybody thinks anybody respects us enough to make sure that we have our security detail when we're going to play at president. Anyway, the EFF further said this is an unacceptable and deliberate form of humiliation. While Cyril Ramaphosa is an incompetent and corrupt buffoon of imperialism who is incapable of taking a first I'm sorry. Okay. While Cyril Ramaphosa is an incompetent and corrupt buffoon of imperialism who is incapable of taking a firm stance on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the South African state and our sovereignty were undermined through him. Yes, completely agreed. For some analysts, while the mission may not have achieved any immediate success, it presented an opportunity for Africa to discuss firsthand the effects of the war, especially on food security, on millions across the continent from Antananarivo to Addis Ababa and Cape Town to Cairo. According to the African Development Bank, the war has led to a shortage of about 30 million tons of grain in Africa. The fact that Africa was able to express itself around the conflict was a good thing. Africa wasn't able to express itself around this conflict because this wasn't an African mission. The African Union would have had to lead this for it to be Africa being able to express itself around the conflict. Some say Africa had no business going there when we have conflicts here. Christopher Afoka Isike, a professor of African politics and international relations at the University of Pretoria, told Al Jazeera. But the conflict is impacting us directly with the shortage of grain exports and fertilizers. The war is a threat to Africa, more so than the conflict in Sudan. It was a matter of continental interest, he added. Meanwhile, Ramaphosa has hailed the initiative as historic, saying the delegation took a non-aligned stance on the issue, which lent credibility to the mission and engendered trust from both sides. That's just not true. Another point of the peace proposal being put forward by African leaders is the opening up of the movement of grains across the Black Sea for grains from Russia or Ukraine to reach world markets, added Ramaphosa in his newsletter. But there is still a perception that Ramaphosa, who led the delegation, was seeking to score points abroad as he faces a barrage of problems at home. This is with regards to Eskom, with the blackouts, and despite the fact that Ramaphosa has appointed a new electricity minister, and also we are in a cost of living crisis, which have made the president increasingly unpopular. I don't believe he was ever popular, but I think he's now outwardly popular with the people who had him installed, which is not only his own party, but also the imperialist factions that support him. The main opposition, Democratic Alliance's John Steenhuisen, told Al Jazeera that millions of rands in taxpayer funds had been wasted on the trip, which I agree with. And he said it was designed to spin the utterly incompetent Ramaphosa out of trouble over his ongoing support for Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. That's his view. He even flew an entire contingent of journalists to Europe in the obvious hope that they would help save his collapsed political image. May I remind everybody that Steenhuisen and the DA were very supportive of Ramaphosa taking over, and we know why. But that is what happens under imperialism. We were collateral damage, Lindsay Detlinger said, a broadcast journalist on the trip, said in an interview with a local radio station. there was a bureaucratic bungle from the South African side. Do you see who gets blamed? South Africa gets stopped in Poland, and South Africa gets blamed. It is Ramaphosa's fault, don't get me wrong, but it shows the absolute hubris, the absolute delusion of a Cyril Ramaphosa, sincerely thinking that South Africa, who have absolutely no collateral on the world stage, is somehow going to bring down. Yes, Ukraine is basically almost a third world country, but we don't believe that, because we don't believe in the idea of poor white people. But Ukraine is not much above South Africa. And then you have Russia, who are a political juggernaut and economic juggernaut, and have been able to withstand sanctions against it. Yes, Africa has been affected by this war, don't get me wrong. I'm not dismissing that. All I'm saying is there is nothing more delusional than thinking that coming from the country with the highest inequality in the world, you can somehow go and bring Europeans who have a certain notion when it comes to you to their knees. And despite my absolute disdain, and I'm pretty convinced I hate him, but despite how I feel about Cyril Ramaphosa, I hope that it is understood that this is not about the ANC. The reason I don't focus on the ANC at this point and I focus on the past is because we are responding to issues that happened 30, 40 years ago. The ANC are carrying on a massacre that began in 1948. They are finalizing a genocide that has slowly been taking place amongst our people. The Oxford Dictionary refers to delusional as characterized by or holding false beliefs or judgments about external reality that are held despite incontrovertible evidence to the contrary, typically as a symptom of a mental condition. And it's also based on or having faulty judgment or being mistaken. Just thought I'd share that. Bye. Like, share, and subscribe, and thanks for listening. Bye.